You've ever stopped to think how a colony of 13 tiny pieces of land became the greatest power on the planet? How a group of rebels turned into a nuclear superpower, home to the biggest tech companies, the stage for cultural revolutions, and deep contradictions? The history of the United States is a roller coaster of wars, crises, conquests, and unexpected turns. And today, you're going to embark on this journey from the beginning to the present, chapter by chapter, like never before. Welcome to Ages and Thrones, the channel where history comes alive, and each civilization, each country, is told like a great saga, with its heroes, conflicts, falls, and glories. If you enjoy this type of content, make sure to subscribe, hit the like button, and comment below what you thought of the video. Oh, and feel free to suggest the next topic. This series only continues with your support. Chapter 1. The birth of an idea. Before it was an empire, before it was a superpower, before it even became a country, the United States were just an idea. A troublesome, stubborn idea, growing between colonial halls, wheat fields, and candlelit meetings. Imagine a group of men, far from the metropolis, tired of paying taxes to a crown they had never seen up close, and deciding that, maybe, just maybe, they could govern themselves. 13 colonies, separated by culture, climate, and interests, united by a spark, freedom. The year is 1776. And like thunder in the silence, the Declaration of Independence echoes, a piece of paper that carried more gunpowder than any British cannon. But independence didn't come with ink, it came with blood. The battles of the American Revolution tore the fields of Pennsylvania, Yorktown, and Bunker Hill. Ill-trained soldiers facing the greatest army in the world. And still, they won. Maybe it was courage, maybe it was desperation, or maybe it was something greater. The birth of a new kind of country, made by and for the people, at least on paper. And there, in the eye of the storm, was he, George Washington. A man who could have been king but chose to be president, who could have commanded but chose to serve. His gesture of returning civil power to the people at the end of the war was like a whisper still echoing, "This is not a monarchy." But creating a nation is easy compared to keeping it united. The colonies, now states, fought like brothers dividing an inheritance. Decisions about currency, commerce, representation. Each step was a minefield. And there, in the suffocating halls of Philadelphia, the Constitution was sewn together with surgical care, an attempt to give shape to chaos. But all they had to do was look at the map and see that the real test was yet to come. Those 13 colonies were just the tip of an entire continent. A continent that was calling, and that the new country was beginning to desire with an insatiable hunger. Chapter 2. Expansion and Contradictions. Independence didn't satisfy them. It opened their appetite. With the ocean at their backs and an entire continent ahead, the United States found themselves like a young giant, newly freed, hungry for space, power, and destiny. It was as if the land itself called. Mountains whispered promises. Plains beckoned with fertile fields. And the skies to the west seemed to paint a message on the horizon. Go! This was when the manifest destiny was born. Not as law, but as faith. An almost mystical belief that Americans had the right, or better yet, the mission, to occupy all of North America. As if God, democracy, and railroad tracks were walking hand in hand. First came peaceful acquisitions. The colossal Louisiana Purchase, made for a handful of coins to France, more than doubled the American territory. Then came audacity, conflicts with Spain, clashes with native tribes, and finally the war against Mexico, which ended with a redrawn map, now including what we call Texas, California, Nevada, Utah, and much more. The country expanded like ink on wet paper. No breaks, no turning back. But with each new piece of land, an old question resurfaced. Will this new land allow slavery? In the north, factories and railways heralded the arrival of modernity. Free labor, growing cities, immigrants in search of a new life. In the south, cotton ruled supreme, and its throne was sustained by the forced labor of millions of enslaved men and women. The country that claimed to seek freedom denied that very freedom to a large portion of its population. It was a glaring hypocrisy, but one many tried to ignore, until it couldn't be anymore. And in the middle of this struggle, indigenous peoples were pushed aside like disposable pieces. Entire tribes were removed from their ancestral lands, through forced marches, broken treaties, and silent exterminations. Railroad tracks ran over ancient stories, and expansion, sold as progress, left a trail of destruction. The frontier advanced, and with it, the contradictions of the United States grew, intertwining like poisoned roots under fertile soil. Until one day, all of this would become unbearable. The tensions between the North and South, freedom and slavery, tradition and change, would explode with the force of thunder. Because there was something dark in the air, something inevitable. A storm was brewing on the horizon, and it had a name: Civil War. Chapter 3: The Civil War. Brother against brother. Sometimes, a country needs to bleed to understand what it truly is. In the early 1860s, the United States were divided like a bridge about to collapse. On one side, the industrial North, fast, modern, with eyes turned to the future. On the other, the agrarian South, traditional, where cotton was king and its throne was supported by enslaved labor. The tension was no longer backstage. It was a pressure cooker about to explode. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 was the spark. He didn't promise immediate abolition of slavery, but even the mere questioning of it was too much for the Southern states. One by one, they began to secede, forming the Confederate States of America, with their own president, army, and flag. A new country inside the old one. Then, in April of 1861, the first shot was fired at Fort Sumter. It wasn't just a cannon that echoed there. It was the sound of a country splitting in two. The war that followed was an open wound. Men who had studied together at West Point now faced each other on opposite sides of the battlefield. Families divided. Brothers aiming their rifles at one another. And while the North mobilized its factories, railways, and immense armies, the South bet on its geography, its skilled generals, and the hope that the world needed its cotton so much it would intervene in its favor. But the war wasn't just a battle of armies. It was a battle of values. The battlefield was also the heart of the country. And there, in the middle of this storm, stood Lincoln, an austere president, but with the soul of a poet. He understood that the war was more than about unity or separation. It was a chance, maybe the last, to redefine what it meant to be American. In 1863 came the symbolic blow, the Emancipation Proclamation. It didn't immediately free everyone, but it gave the war a new meaning. Now, it wasn't just politics. It was justice. The war would last 4 long years, with epic battles like Antietam, Gettysburg, Vicksburg, and so many others that stained maps and history books. More than 600,000 lives would be lost. The greatest tragedy in American history. And even the North's victory, with the surrender of the Confederates in 1865, felt more like a sigh of exhaustion than a celebration. Slavery was finally abolished. But abolishing on paper doesn't heal the heart. Because the South was devastated. Cities destroyed. The economy in ruins. And rage that still burned like embers hidden beneath ash. The war was over. But the reconstruction, it would be even harder. Chapter 4: Steam, Steel, and Ambition. The smoke of war still lingered in the air. But a new smoke began to take its place. Denser, more persistent. It didn't come from cannons, but from chimneys. The sound wasn't that of gunshots anymore. It was the creaking of rails, the hammering of nails, the shrill whistle of locomotives crossing the country like serpents of iron. The United States were being reborn, but not like before. Now it was work that moved the nation, profit that set the pace, and progress became a religion. Cities like New York, Chicago, and Detroit exploded in size and ambition. Skyscrapers began to challenge gravity. Railroad tracks connected coasts. Telegraph wires stitched the country together in real time. And at the center of it all were they, the new kings. Men with tall hats and deep pockets. Carnegie, with his steel empire. Rockefeller, taming oil. Vanderbilt, commanding the rails. And J.P. Morgan, the banker who lent money even to the government. They were called titans, and also robber barons. It depended on where you looked. From the top of their towers, they were visionaries. From the factories and slums, they were giant shadows sucking the last cent out of the workers. In the factories, men, women, and children worked exhausted, 12, 14, 16 hours a day. And still they dreamed. They dreamed of a better life.
Immigrants arrived by the millions, bringing suitcases full of hope and names hard to pronounce. The Statue of Liberty welcomed them with a torch in hand. But on the other side of the bay, reality awaited them with calluses and sweat. It was the so-called American dream, born among machines, soot, and contracts. A dream that many pursued, but few reached. Wealth grew, power grew, but, like a shadow following the sun, inequality grew alongside. And the cracks, now invisible, began to form again, not between states, but between classes. And while the United States rose as an economic powerhouse, the world outside began to simmer. Because soon, the industrial country would be called to face something much bigger than the market. Something coming from across the ocean, with bayonets, trenches, and promises of glory. If you've made it this far, it means you're enjoying the video. To help us bring you more content like this, subscribe and hit the like button. I trust you. Chapter 5: World Wars and the Forging of a Giant. In the early 20th century, the United States were still not the rulers of the world. They were big, yes, ambitious, but the main stage of global politics was still Europe, with its centuries-old empires, blue-blooded kings, and alliances as fragile as a house of cards. An entire continent was holding its breath. And then, boom! In 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated in Sarajevo. The spark ignites the powder keg. What starts as a localized conflict spreads like wildfire. France, Germany, England, Austria-Hungary, Russia. One by one, they dive into World War I. A modern war, but with old mentalities. Horses against machine guns. Heroic charges against trenches full of mud, rats, and mustard gas. On the other side of the Atlantic, the United States watched from a distance, like someone watching their neighbor's house burn and pretending it won't reach theirs. The country continued to grow, selling arms, food, and supplies to the Allies. The war seemed like a European problem, until it wasn't anymore. American ships began to be attacked by German submarines. The most famous was the Lusitania, sunk with over 1,000 civilians aboard. And then came the tipping point. The Zimmermann telegram, a German attempt to convince Mexico to attack the U.S. That was enough. In 1917, President Woodrow Wilson declared war, and the United States entered the conflict, as if they were arriving at the end of a tragic play, but still willing to change the script. They were decisive. Their fresh and well-equipped troops gave the final push to the Allies. And when the war ended, in 1918, the Americans came home with their heads held high. They had been the tipping point. But the cost? Nearly 120,000 soldiers dead. A devastated Europe. And a peace, the Treaty of Versailles, that felt more like a ticking time bomb. The next decade would be marked by euphoria. The roaring 20s. The crazy years. Jazz, radio, cars, movies, consumption. America shone like never before. But behind the gleaming windows, the foundation was unstable. In 1929, came the crash. The New York stock market crash was like a financial earthquake. It broke banks, broke businesses, broke families. The Great Depression wiped out jobs, led millions to hunger, and turned the American dream into a distant echo. And then, when the country was still trying to recover with Roosevelt's New Deal, the world began to twist again. In Germany, a frustrated former soldier, with a hypnotic voice and fiery gaze, was rising to power. Adolf Hitler, with his Nazi party, promised glory, vengeance, and order. But what he would deliver was hate, war, and genocide. The world began to boil. And in 1939, with the invasion of Poland, World War II began. Once again, the United States tried to stay out. The trauma from World War I still stung. But then, on December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Japan attacks the American naval base in Hawaii. A devastating ambush. In a few hours, thousands dead. Ships sunk, planes in flames, and the silence turns into fury. Now, there was no turning back. The United States went in full force, against the Axis powers. Germany, Italy, Japan. And their entry changed everything. American factories, once slowed down by the Depression, roared again.
They produced tanks, airplanes, ammunition, on a scale the world had never seen.
The entire country mobilized. Women took over jobs in factories. African Americans faced racism to serve in the army. Society transformed, not by choice, but by necessity. On the European front, Americans landed on Normandy on the famous D-Day and advanced through occupied Europe. In the Pacific, they fought brutal battles against Japan, island by island, sweat by sweat, blood by blood. And when Japan refused to surrender, came the darkest chapter. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. The only 2 times nuclear bombs were used against civilians. Entire cities turned to dust in seconds. The world watched, stunned. The war ended. But something new was born there. Something frightening. The United States emerged from the war victorious, rich, powerful, and alone at the top. Now, they were the only nation with the atomic bomb. The country that helped win the war had, in the blink of an eye, become the world's new guardian. But every victory has a price. Because in the vacuum of war, a new enemy was rising. One that didn't wear uniforms or tanks, but had missiles, ideology, and nuclear power. Chapter 6. The Cold War. The nuclear chess game. When the smoke of World War II dissipated, the world didn't breathe a sigh of relief. It held its breath. On the map, 2 superpowers stared at each other in silence. The United States and the Soviet Union. On one side, capitalism. On the other, communism. And between them, the entire planet. It was the beginning of a war without open battles, but with pointed weapons, infiltrated spies, and minds in constant alert. The United States had the bomb, but not for long. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested its own. And what was once an advantage turned into a balance of terror. The name for this? Mutually assured destruction. A game where no one could win, but everyone could lose. The Cold War was a contest of power, prestige, and paranoia. It wasn't enough to be strong. You had to seem invincible. The skies became catwalks for spy satellites.
The space race began with the Soviet Sputnik launch, and the Americans responded with rockets, astronauts, and the promise that they would be the first to set foot on the moon.
But the tension wasn't just in the skies.
On the ground, the world became a board game.
In Korea, in Vietnam, in Cuba, the 2 giants fought by proxy, using other nations as pieces, soldiers as pawns. Each conflict was a rehearsal for the end of the world. And then came 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The planet held its breath for 13 days. Soviet ships carrying nuclear warheads. American submarines surrounding the island. The red button was closer than ever. It only took one mistake, one misunderstanding, and it would be over. But the button wasn't pressed. Not yet. Meanwhile, back home, Americans lived between progress and panic. Children practiced drills at school, hiding under desks as if wood could stop an atomic bomb. Movies, magazines, speeches, everything talked about the red threat. The enemy was everywhere. Or at least, that's what they said. The Cold War was a war of narratives, of symbols, of fear. But it was also a mirror. Because, as the country fought the external danger, a new revolution was bubbling up inside its borders. Chapter 7. Rebellion and Change. While the leaders played chess with the world, the streets of the United States were turning into stages for another revolution. One that didn't wear uniforms, but ripped jeans, handmade signs, and hoarse voices from shouting too much. The 1960s arrived like thunder. Colorful, loud, chaotic. The country that called itself the land of freedom began to face mirrors it had always avoided. Black people marched for civil rights, facing not only unjust laws but batons, dogs, and high-pressure hoses. Amidst the noise, one voice rose like a clarion. Martin Luther King Jr., with his "I Have a Dream" speech, not just speaking, but drawing a future that still seemed impossible. And he wasn't alone. Malcolm X, more direct, more forceful, said, "If it's necessary for peace, we'll fight for peace. But if it's necessary for war." The country wasn't just divided by race, but by ways of resistance. At the same time, a new youth was taking over universities, public squares, and festivals. It was the counterculture. Young people questioning everything. The war, consumption, morals, short hair, the authority of parents. Woodstock became the symbol of this psychedelic rebellion, where guitars screamed louder than generals. And in the middle of all this, the Vietnam War. A war far away, in tropical jungles, that seemed endless and purposeless. The United States, sure they were fighting communism, plunged into a conflict that turned to mud between their fingers. Soldiers came home broken inside. Many didn't come back. The images of Vietnam didn't come in letters. They came on TV, in color, during prime time.
For the first time, the American people were watching the war in real time.
And what they saw was devastating. Protests spread.
Make love, not war. Hell no, we won't go.
Young people burned their draft cards while the government tried to hold a nation that was slipping through the cracks. Amidst the chaos, other voices still echoed. Feminists demanding space, environmentalists warning of destruction, LGBTQ+ breaking the silence. It was as if all the ghosts of America had decided to rise. All at once. Chapter 8. The Digital Empire.
When the screams ceased and the posters were gathered, what could be heard was the sound of keyboards. Timid, mechanical, promising.
The 1980s weren't made of marches, but of microchips. The country that once screamed for peace now whispered on the screens of the first computers. America traded flowers for silicon. And almost without warning, the era of information began. Ronald Reagan rose to power with the charisma of an actor and a cowboy speech. He promised to cut taxes, reduce the state, and let the market run wild.
And it did.
The economy grew, Wall Street shone, consumption became religion.
Television shaped behaviors.
McDonald's dominated street corners. And the American dream was sold in 30-second commercials. It was also the birth of a new kind of empire, the digital empire.
While the Berlin Wall crumbled in 1989, taking the Soviet Union down with it and ending the Cold War, the United States took center stage globally.
But now, the battlefield was something else. Data, clicks, and algorithms. The internet, which had started as a military project, spread through universities, then homes, then pockets.
Microsoft, Apple, Google, Amazon, names that would shape the daily lives of billions of people, with power almost as great as that of any government.
The United States no longer exported just products. It exported lifestyle, culture, information, dreams. Every pair of jeans, every blockbuster, every operating system was an American flag planted in a globalized world. But with connectivity came isolation. With freedom of expression came bubbles. And while everyone celebrated the arrival of the new millennium, no one realized the ground was already shaking. Because the next blow wouldn't come from a declared war, but from an airplane, a too blue sky, and two towers that touched the sky. Chapter 9. Crises, Shocks, and Scars. September 11th, 2001 was not just a terrorist attack.
It was the day the world, as the United States knew it, changed forever.
Two hijacked airplanes struck the World Trade Center towers in New York City, and a third collided with the Pentagon, in Washington. And amidst all the destruction, the towers that represented global financial power collapsed, taking something more with them: the confidence of Americans in the security of their own land. Until then, the United States had been accustomed to seeing war, terror, and destruction in other countries, but never on their own soil. The attack caused the sense of invulnerability the nation had cultivated to dissipate in an instant. The impact wasn't only physical, it was psychological. Fear was now in the streets, in schools, in the eyes of the citizens, in the air. The country reacted with the force it knew: a military response. Bombing campaigns began in Afghanistan, where the Taliban harbored Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda, responsible for the attacks. The war seemed to have a clear purpose: eliminate terror. However, what seemed like a fight against an identifiable enemy soon became a never-ending conflict, marked by uncertainty, deaths, and a society constantly on edge. While missiles tore through the air in the Middle East, life in the United States would never be the same. Domestic security became a flexible and intrusive concept. Laws like the Patriot Act came into effect, granting the government broad powers to spy on its own citizens in the name of security. Fear invaded homes, schools, and streets. The war on terror paradoxically became a war against freedom in the name of freedom. But the pain of 2001 didn't end there. In the years that followed,
the US economy still seemed to hold steady. But a new problem was silently forming in the background. The 2008 financial crisis was lurking. And this time, the enemy wasn't in a distant desert, but in the foundations of the financial system the United States had created. In 2007, the housing market was booming. Banks offered subprime mortgages to people who could not afford them. These mortgages were sold to investors as safe products, when in reality, they were about to collapse. But no one seemed to care, or maybe no one wanted to see the tragedy coming. Greed and blind confidence in the markets had created an economic bubble on the verge of bursting. The subprime crisis, as it became known, wasn't just a housing bubble. It was a reflection of much greater failures within the financial system of the United States and the world. Global banks, like Lehman Brothers, that seemed invincible, began to collapse when toxic mortgages and financial derivatives started to lose value, causing a domino effect throughout the economy. In September of 2008, Lehman Brothers collapsed. The market went into a panic. The stock market plummeted. Banks began to fail, and a lack of confidence in the financial markets spread like wildfire. The United States government was forced to intervene, rescuing financial institutions with trillions of dollars, all to prevent a total collapse of the economy. But the bailout was a double-edged sword. While Wall Street was propped up with the help of the government, millions of everyday citizens were losing their homes. Unemployment was at record highs. The housing market collapsed. Entire families, who had put their life savings into purchasing homes, saw their properties taken from them. The American dream, now more than ever, seemed like a distant illusion for most people. The shock wasn't just financial. It was human. The crisis left a trail of anguish, distrust, and frustration that spread across the country. The system that once seemed to guarantee stability and prosperity now showed its chronic flaws. And the people, those who suffered the most, were not the ones who should have paid the price. The middle class, one of the main drivers of America's economic rise, was now being crushed under the weight of the collapse that they themselves had helped create. This was the great irony of the 2008 crisis. The powerful, responsible for the crisis, were bailed out, while the most vulnerable, who barely had enough to survive, found themselves drowning in debt, bankruptcies, and financial insecurity. Chapter 10. Between Algorithms and Uncertainty. The United States, which had led the world for over a century with its factories, railroads, and skyscrapers, now faced a new revolution. No longer in iron or steel, but in silicon. In 2007, the world watched, stunned, as Steve Jobs, with his elegant simplicity, introduced the first iPhone. And there, on a brightly lit stage, a revolution began to spread from the pocket of one individual to the lives of millions. The smartphone wasn't just a tool. It was a portal to the world, and with it, the idea that everything could be connected in real time. The internet, once a distant place, a luxury, now became ubiquitous. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram emerged as new public squares where ideas collided, spread, and consumed each other. But as this new digital empire rose, the confidence of the American people in truth, authority, and reality began to wear thin. It was the birth of an era where data, no longer oil or weapons, was the new power. Google and Amazon came to dominate the global market, not with physical products, but with information. The data of American citizens, and the world, became the primary commodity of billion-dollar companies. And with this vertiginous growth, new dilemmas arose. Privacy became an obsolete concept. Digital manipulation flourished. Fake news, biased algorithms, constant surveillance. All of this became a permanent shadow over connected societies. The 2016 elections, for example, revealed a world where digital influence and polarization were on the verge of splitting the nation. In the political landscape, polarization grew. Donald Trump was elected president, and America, once again, found itself divided. The same algorithms that connected people also separated them. An era of information began to be overtaken by an era of misinformation. At the same time, the social issues that had been behind so many crises were still unresolved. Economic inequality seemed to intensify as the middle class shrank and large corporations became more powerful. The workers of the old economy couldn't adapt to the new digital world. And the problems of racism, police violence, and social injustice remained with a growing weight. As the country looked to the future seemed more uncertain than ever. Technological unemployment, climate change, cyber wars,
and an unstable global economy. All of this weighed heavily on the horizon. And at the same time, the United States, once a beacon of democracy, found itself confronted with questions about its own identity. With that, the question that arose was no longer about which direction to follow, but about how to navigate the chaos of the 21st century, where nothing was simple, and everything moved faster than society's ability to adapt. Chapter 11. The Present. Between the Past and the Future. The United States, a country always in search of evolution, now finds itself facing unprecedented challenges. However, what we see today is not just a reflection of past economic or political struggles. It is the result of a new world, shaped by powerful technologies and internal divisions that threaten social cohesion. American society, while recovering from the scars left by the 2008 financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic, now faces new and old battles. Political polarization, misinformation, economic inequality, and systemic racism. Politically, the United States finds itself more divided than ever. The 2020 election, marked by the pandemic and one of the most polarized periods in modern history, exposed deep wounds within American society. The election of Joe Biden and the subsequent January 2021 attack on the Capitol by extremists marked a dramatic turning point, with the U.S. grappling with political violence and the growth of the far right within its territory. The attack on Congress reflected a nation on the verge of a democratic collapse, with an uncertain future on how to regain trust in its institutions. The phenomenon of misinformation has also become one of the greatest challenges of the modern era. With the advent of social media, fake news, and recommendation algorithms amplifying extremist voices, fueling even greater division. The use of platforms like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok became not just a reflection of culture, but a powerful tool to shape political and social opinions, often in dangerous and polarized ways. The role of these networks, especially in QAnon movements and incitement to the Capitol riot, represents the new battle for information and for control over it. However, technology is not just a source of division, but also of innovation. The COVID-19 crisis accelerated the digitalization of many aspects of life, from home office to online education, revealing inequalities among social classes, but also transforming the economy and the job market. The country found itself needing to adapt its healthcare system, showing both its limits and the resilience of its infrastructure. The pandemic also painfully exposed the economic disparities. The rich got richer, while millions of essential workers and small businesses went bankrupt or struggled to survive. This widened the already existing social and economic inequality. The impact of monetary policies and the economic bailout put the American capitalist model into question, especially when millions still faced financial struggles while billion-dollar companies continued to thrive. The Black Lives Matter movement also gained momentum in recent years, with the killing of George Floyd in 2020 sparking mass protests for racial justice, showing the world that the fight against systemic racism in the United States is far from resolved. Floyd's death, captured on video, ignited a global awakening to police brutality against black people, and the movement continued to push for structural change. Yet, as the United States turned inward and confronted these battles, the country remained a focal point of global influence. Technology, through companies like Apple, Google, Tesla, and SpaceX, represents the future of innovation, but also brings with it questions about privacy, data control, and social impacts. Elon Musk, with his leadership in space and electric car industries, reflects America's ambition to maintain its global leadership position, now also in space and technology. The challenge of combating climate change and dealing with natural disasters has also become a central issue. Hurricanes, wildfires, and heat waves that intensify each year highlight the vulnerability of the United States to the environmental crisis. Yet, at the same time, Joe Biden's administration committed to rejoining the Paris Agreement and placing the country at the forefront of the fight against climate change. And in the geopolitical landscape, the most tangible strategic rival to the U.S. is China. The rivalry between these two superpowers, in areas such as technology, trade, and international security, defines the new dynamics of the 21st century. The technology war, the battle for 5G networks, and the domination of the Atlantic and Pacific are just some of the fronts in this global conflict. And so, we come to the end of this journey. A country that began with 13 colonies and today finds itself divided, but still with the potential to reinvent itself, as it has always done throughout history. I deeply thank everyone who joined me on this deep dive into the history of the United States, and the history of the world through the lens of one of the most influential countries of all time. Following this journey, with its highs and lows, its moments of glory and deep wounds, is understanding what it means to be human,
in all its complexity. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and leave your comment with suggestions for the next theme. Because history never ends. It continues, evolves, challenges us, and always has something new to teach. See you next time.